thank you so much. So first of all, thank you for having me here to talk today. A little bit about myself. So I live in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. Here's me posing with a very appropriately Gothic giant skeleton on one of our beautiful beaches. And by day, I work as a journalist. And by night, I mean, to be honest, I don't actually make like nice, weird little dark video games, but I think about making them. And like maybe once in a blue moon, I actually do. But the most important thing about my background for this talk is that I'm not from game design or coding or computer science or game studies, any of that. I'm from a background in English literature, which might be why I'm the only person who's brought a sheaf of paper, repping the sheaf of paper. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about, well, I'm going to be talking about Gothic literature and interactive fiction specifically, as I'm sure you know. But I'm also going to be talking about literature and game studies more widely, about what one can learn from the other, and about how maybe there isn't an other after all. First, I hope to prove an undeniable connection between Gothic literature and interactive fiction, with the echoes of Gothic's unfamiliar spaces and haunting presences being felt in interactive fiction from the medium's invention to the present day. I should jump in here right now and say that I'm talking about text-based interactive fiction, so think Inform 7, think Twine. And then I want to propose that we can use that connection, both as a practical source of inspiration for our game design and as one thread to help us understand the entire history of human stories more widely. But first of all, are we good? Oh, okay. Baffling with my levels. So let's rewind 3 years to when I first started really seriously thinking about how I wanted to combine my casual interest in games with my sort of literary, I hate to say the word literary career, that sounds awful, but I suppose that's what it was. So back then I was studying English at the University of St Andrews, and this all starts really with my undergraduate dissertation, which was Traverse Trashscape, the legacy of text adventure games in Porpentine Charity Heartscape's hypertext fiction. Now I am looking really pleased with myself because I was like, I'm finally done. So I hadn't discovered Porpentine's pioneering work in the underground Twine scene that long ago, but as soon as I read it, I just fell in love. I knew that this is what I had to write my dissertation on. Her work, whether in the mind prison of howling dogs, the dreamlike lurches of imagery in Their Angelical Understanding, or the dizzying hyperstructures of Metrolith, filled me with this sense of foreboding and dread, this like awed terror that I had never felt before. I couldn't look away, basically. Now, notice I said unlike anything I had ever felt before. Hold that thought, we're going to come back to that. But then, so I wasn't originally planning to analyse them as games so much as just as written text. But this all changed when I started doing research for my dissertation. I looked for discussion of Porpentine's games within the vast database of all articles ever written for English literature that you get when you study literature at university, and there was nothing. I could find nothing discussing what I saw not only as the most exciting writing being written, but the most exciting stuff being written right now, in the present day. This was a big thing. This was the cutting edge of what the written word looked like, and nobody in the subject seemed to really be paying attention. Now, this was especially odd to me, because a cursory look had told me that hypertext fiction, of which anything made in Twine undoubtedly is, because it's about going from one passage to another through a series of links, had attracted a fair bit of attention back in the day, we're talking days of the early internet. So I was like, what's going on here? What changed? And then I found this passage that I'm going to read from J. Yellowlease Douglas, who's one of hypertext fiction's most high-profile names, and suddenly it all kind of fell into place. This is what she has to say about Colossal Cave Adventure by Will Cowper, the text adventure game. Digital narratives primarily follow the trajectory of adventure, a work considered venerable only by the techies who first played it in the 1970s, cyber gaming geeks, and the writers, theorists, and practitioners who deal with interactivity. Hypertext fiction, on the other hand, follows and furthers the trajectory of hallowed touchstones of print culture, especially the avant-garde novel. I was too late, clearly. The line had already been drawn. If something tipped the invisible scales into being a game, scary capitals included, it wasn't literature anymore, or at least it had nothing to do with the hallowed touchstones of print culture, whatever those are. It's worth remembering this quote because I'm going to be coming back to it. And at the moment, it was important because it sent me into a rage that only a 10,000-word-long rant could quench. Suddenly, I knew that to ignore the gameness of Porpentine's work would be giving in. It would just be emphasizing this dichotomy that made me so cross. So instead, I embraced it. I went looking for her inspiration in territory that was previously uncharted to me. Classic text adventure games whose parser system would be replaced in her work with Twine's hyperlinks, but whose spirit of interactive fiction she inherited. Inventories, player characters, what it meant to win and lose. I fell headfirst into the world of game studies and into the beauty of all interactive fiction, from the most classic pick up a sword, go north style fantasy adventures to the most famously experimental. And then came the spring of 2020. Several things happened that year, the most important to me being that I took a course in Gothic literature from the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, remember that thought we held a little while ago about how I felt playing Porpentine's games for the first time? Here it was again, and I recognized it with surprise and delight. I recognized it as I scrambled through the dungeons of the castle of Otranto, as I uncovered the secrets of the monk, as I made my way through the dark hallways of the mysteries of Udolpho. I realized that reading these books, written centuries ago, made me feel the same way as I did playing my favorite games. The closest thing I can compare it to is when you introduce two of your close friends and you love both friends, but you worry that they won't get along, and then they just start chatting like they've known each other for 20 years, and you're just like, oh, fantastic. So in case you haven't noticed, when it comes to art, I'm a pretty sentimental person. So I took the only real course of action to me available at this time, and I made those feelings into a weird little video game. So White Dresses on Branches is made in Twine and was featured in Indiepocalypse in January 2021. Buy Indiepocalypse, it's fantastic, everyone buy Indiepocalypse. Now, it isn't just about the relationship between Gothic literature and interactive fiction. It's also about what it's like to grow up and what it's like to not know yourself and what it might be like if giant tapeworms took over the world. But Gothic fiction is a pretty big part of it. Also, I promise this whole talk is not just a big advert for White Dresses on Branches, although it is free on itch and it will take only 20 minutes out of your day, so. But I do think it's a useful place for me to begin, especially when it comes to sorting out where, to me, maybe the less obvious connections between Gothic literature and interactive fiction lie. Because, and here's where that very, 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 very long introduction ends, so thanks for sticking with me, some of these connections are really quite obvious. There have been several quite specific and self-conscious send-ups to the Gothic genre in interactive fiction, such as Nate Cole's Nevermore or Michael S. Gentry's Anchorhead, but both come with the subtitle, both come with the subtitle An Interactive Gothic. Now, I want to cast a bit of a wider net. I believe that rather than any in-game allusions to the genre, the Gothicness of interactive fiction is baked into its very medium, its parsers, its linked passages, and yes, its traditional aesthetics. So let's start there. What is a Gothic aesthetic if we're comparing aesthetics? Well, as we learned earlier, Wikipedia is always a great place to start. So Gothic fiction is a loose literary aesthetic of fear and haunting. One of my favorite Wikipedia opening lines ever. I love it. So it says all that really needs to be said. Gothic is about feeling nervous, unsure, that feeling that something is wrong. If you peek even slightly into literary studies of Gothic fiction, you'll see how central to our understanding of the whole genre is the idea of the uncanny, as it was famously described in Freud's essay titled, well, The Uncanny. His examples contain a laundry list of Gothic tropes: animated corpses, unexplained doubles, ghostly apparitions. But one of the most interesting for our purpose right now is the German word he uses, unheimlich, literally unhomely. Gothic literature is about the horror of an unfamiliar place. In other words, about being lost. traditionally speaking, in the dark. The first rule of a text adventure game, find the lantern. Anyone who's spent enough time trying to navigate adventure's twisty little passages knows that getting lost is essentially what the earliest text adventure games are about. No wonder Nick Montfort named his book that. Great book, by the way. Basically what got this talk going, so thank you, Nick Montfort. So instead of going through the frankly embarrassing list of places I got lost in text adventure games in order to prove this point, we can go back and maybe try to prove it by the opposite. What does getting lost look like in interactive fiction compared to what it's definitely not, those pieces of hypertext fiction beloved by literary academics back in the day? Those were the future, technology used right. They were open, as freeing as cyberspace itself, and yet crucially not overwhelming. Here's how J. Yellowlease Douglas describes her hypertext novel, I Have Said Nothing. So the game was designed to enable readers to navigate through the narrative using a variety of strategies, cognitive map, selecting hot words on the text, or relying on narrative defaults, or viewing a menu of available paths. Jeff Ryman's hypertext work 253, which is a masterpiece, by the way, is more literal still, providing a map modelled after those in the London Underground, a journey planner linked in every passage, a permanent escape hatch for the confused reader who's thinking, hypertext fiction, I don't know about that, I don't know how to do that. Compare this treatment of mapping to that of adventure. It seems a little ridiculous to say it out loud, but providing a map to a text adventure game would, in oftentimes, kind of defeat the entire point of the game. The very idea of using a map to navigate was an anathema to adventure's early devotees. Mary J. McCullis, who created a hand-drawn map of Will Crowther's cave system, prefaces it with, if you haven't completed the game, then please don't look. You may be frustrated at the moment by the shadowy figure waving back at you from across the pit, or you may be at wit's end, but stick with it without looking at the map. I adore this quote because it so beautifully demonstrates where the meaning is in both interactive fiction and Gothic literature. It's in the questions, not the answers, the searching out, not really what you find at the end. People often like to make fun of the Gothic. If you've read Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, that's a great example of the, honestly, scorn that was poured on the genre in its own time. And a big part of that was because people looked at the conclusions, the last pages, the big reveal where they see the ghost, and they say, this is kind of lame and contrived. And mostly it is. I mean, I don't know if anyone in the audience has read The Mysteries of Rodolfo, but I love that book, and even I can say, oh man, the conclusions to that book is not great. But, but it doesn't matter, because the answers, the conclusions, they don't matter. Gothic literature isn't about whether the ghost is real. It's about what it feels like to know you're trapped in a room with something, to think you're trapped in a room with a ghost. So this reliance on the questions over the answers really, I mean, it put Gothic literature apart from both defining modes of thought at the time, which was the traditional deference to Christianity, where, of course, there is one big, definite, absolute answer, and he's God, and the new Enlightenment, which said there's another big, definite answer, and that's science, and science is always right, and us smart men can tell you what's always right all the time. Gothic literature was sort of for silly young women who were more interested in romance than any kind of grand truth, in sensationalism than any kind of true, right, correct literature. Does that sound familiar? It might sound familiar. We'll get back to it. So here we are in the new Enlightenment of the internet. We were supposed to have all the answers spread out before us. In interactive fiction, we found ourselves in weird, dark tunnels, both figuratively and literally, as we stare at our pitch-black screens with just a single room picked out in a pool of white text, scrambling from passage to passage, crawling through obstacles. When I made White Dresses on Branches, this applied even when I was, kind of backstage, as it were. Every passage I added felt like uncovering another room, like stumbling deeper and exploring further into the corridors of my character and world. The choices and exploration that are, part and parcel of interactive fiction is not some terrible gameness that divides it from literature. It's a wonderful gameness that connects it to literature, to the whole canon. So, interactive fiction is basically a big, weird, creepy, hard-to-navigate house, right? Okay, perfect for haunting. But what's haunting it? The sick dread of Gothic literature is the feeling of something watching you from the shadows. And of course, when we played text adventure games, we were never really alone in that cave. I'm not just talking about enemies or non-player characters here. I'm talking about that wonderful peculiarity of text-based interactive fiction, that omnipresent narrator whose words form all the world we have. In my dissertation, I referred to interactive fiction's sort of meta-narrative presence, the voice telling us all the things, as games masters. I wanted to find a way to encompass both the text parsers that provide responses to our inputs in text adventure games and the voice that provides us options in link-based hypertext games. I also wanted to reference the oft-repeated fact that Will Crowther took inspiration from his games of Dungeons and Dragons when creating the personal, lovely, often tongue-in-cheek world of Colossal Cave Adventure. No doubt that this connection was seen by those who wanted to dismiss interactive fiction as just more proof that it was for gross nerds. But maybe because I am a gross nerd, I took something very different from it. To me, this is evidence that, from the very inception of interactive fiction, game designers have been fascinated by what's there with us in the dark. From Emily Short's rumination on artificial intelligence, Galatea, to Eli Pyladin's meta-psychological horror, You Find Yourself in a Dark Room, or You Find Yourself in a Room, rather. I always get it confused with In a Dark Room, which is also a very good piece of interactive fiction. Interactive fiction has never been content to simply let the games master spit out objective answers. It always has its own voice. I believe this is because the relationship between the player and the games master is inherently one of the most fascinating things about interactive fiction. The games master guides us, but it also confounds us. It congratulates us on our successes, but in the end, it's the one that drops the rocks on our heads. It kills us. Above all, it is utterly, utterly in control, even though that maybe sounds a little bit paradoxical for a video game, that medium of interactivity. When even the actions to slay dragons come in the form of negotiations with a text parser, the power fantasies of many video games are nowhere to be found. But this is old news to pretty much anyone at a narrative games convention, sorry. So where does the Gothic come in? Well, let's start by talking in the most practical terms possible. If you're a games designer struggling on how to characterize the narrative voice of your next piece of interactive fiction, you won't find a better catalogue of ghosts to put in your machine than in the pages of classic Gothic fiction. Because for every helpless hero in the Gothic, there's a force pulling the strings, whether it be the immense supernatural power that dooms the characters of the Castle of Otranto, or the murderous, possessive man who lurks at the heart of the mysteries of Udolpho. A Gothic presence, like a games master, might offer the hero a clue 1 minute and lead them down the wrong corridor the next. It might reach out a hand, but that hand might be holding a dagger. To read and study Gothic fiction is to become an expert in how to make a power dynamic as terrifying as possible. In White Dresses on Branches, I took power dynamics that had struck me when reading some of my favourite Gothic texts and pushed them to the next level. The protagonist of the game's third act is a governess walking a girl on a beach. They both come from the Institute, a vast building that trains governesses, teaches young girls, and controls both of them. I based this part of the game's world very consciously on Gothic inspiration. Governesses pop up again and again in the genre, perhaps most famously in something like The Turn of the Screw, which is an amazing book. They're both a fascinating disruption of the Christian heteronormative family unit and serve as a great plot device in that they're a way for a single female character to live a relatively independent life. I wanted to make the Institute the horror of that one glimmer of hope corrupted. I had first intended it to be a distant threat, sort of suggested by a more objective narration, but almost inevitably it started creeping into the game's voice. I found myself adding sort of snide remarks. We'd make a choice that the Institute might deem wrong, even though it wouldn't maybe be wrong in the context of the game, and get little, oh, you've broken the rules, you know you shouldn't be doing this. Making White Dresses interactive fiction, I was also able to take that power imbalance, that Gothic threat, and make it feel all the more real than, say, if I'd written something like a Gothic take on a short story. When it is the choices that you, in the real world, are making that are being shot down, the boundaries between fiction and reality are broken. Again, that's old news for anyone at a narrative game convention. But maybe I was now closer than ever to understanding what reading The Mysteries of Udolpho as a young girl when it came out would have been like. We are so used to seeing the stereotypical Gothic heroine, all petticoats and a candle held aloft and going sort of, that it can often be, we see it as a representative, as an age gone by, a genre gone before. And it's easy to forget that for many readers at the time, they were watching terrifying things happen to someone who looked like them, who dressed like them, who spoke like them. I wanted to create that connection again. I wanted to get away from that distance we have from the Gothic, and indeed from all classic literature. And I wanted to make it maybe less easy to just laugh at those old cliches. Because the relationship between games and literature isn't just about taking what's come before as inspiration. It's about using the games we make today to look differently at the art people made centuries ago. It's about a two-way exchange, about taking the wealth of analysis and criticism and understanding about one chunk of human art and being able to use it to help us better understand another. If we don't do this, we have to start from scratch every time. Game studies is a young discipline, but we're just one part of something as old as human history, when, probably unintentionally but still wrongly, literary academics drew two big boxes that said literature and games. They opened a gulf between two libraries, one well-stocked, one fresh. I would love for this talk to be one brick in a bridge between them. But I also don't want this talk to just be about how old, stuffy literary academics are evil and bad and us new, cool generation of gamers are like good and with it. Let's go back to that quote from Eloise Douglas. Now, what's so ridiculous about it is that the hallowed touchstones of print culture undeniably include Gothic novels, which were themselves widely derided as not, widely derided as not real literature when they were being published. Understanding the history of the Gothic is to understand the life cycle of any art that steps outside boundaries. Knee-jerk rejection followed by a late acceptance of its power and importance. This is a cycle that's also repeating itself in our community. So as an example, and to go sort of fully full circle, I can go back to one of the games that was a huge part of my work on my dissertation. Porpentine's Cyber Queen is everything I love about interactive fiction, Gothic literature, and the intersection between the two. If you haven't played it, which in that case, go and play it, it's a story about being hunted through the corridors of a spaceship by an AI gone rogue. The AI controls everything. There is no escape, and crucially, there is no winning. You can make choices, but in the end, the player character will always be completely taken over, spoilers, and sort of absorbed. Spoilers for Cyber Queen, great game. Will just sort of be absorbed into this horrible, slimy nexus. It's great game. It's terrifying and it's devastating. It's really important, I think. And here are some quotes from one review of it I found on the Interactive Fiction database. Eventually, after getting through that introduction bit, you're given something that almost looks like a real piece of interactive fiction. Nothing you do in this game matters. You can cooperate with this AI, you can fight this AI, you can struggle against this AI, and it will all end in the exact same manner. If I wanted that, I wouldn't be on a website claiming to be about interactive fiction. I love the caps there. So, just as with the boom of Enlightenment literature, certain people seem to have decided the right way that a medium can function. Widely printed books must encourage rational minds. Interactive fiction must offer, thanks to its choices, a sort of glittering array of beautiful alternate endings. The world must make sense, the ghost must have the sheep pulled off its head, and the player must be able to win. If you've come up against this attitude, and it's gotten you down, I know it's gotten me down sometimes, I offer you the Gothic. Read it, love it, and take fierce comfort in all the other people who love it. Make weird shit that refuses to give answers and makes people angry. This is pretty much my manifesto. And studying Gothic literature and the contemporary reaction to it made me realize that if anyone ever starts describing your game as not real, insert medium here, that's like a really good sign that you're on the right track and you should keep doing whatever it is you're doing. Now, you might be thinking, Eve, what you're saying here could sort of apply to any kind of transgressive art, not just the Gothic. And you would actually be 100% right. This might sort of sound like a strange thing to say after literally traveling across the sea and speaking for 30 minutes about Gothic literature and interactive fiction, but I don't actually think that there's anything unique in the relationship between Gothic literature and interactive fiction. Sorry if that's an anticlimax. I believe it's important, but I also think that these connections are everywhere. It's going to take a lot of bricks to build that bridge, if you remember that weird metaphor from like a few paragraphs ago. This talk has been about a personal connection that I made, something I happened to see naturally emerging from like the little slice of human texts, human stories that I have been so lucky enough to read in my short span on this earth. It meant, what I saw there meant that I ended up making a game that I absolutely loved and had so much fun making. And somewhere in the brilliant web of millennia of humans trying to understand each other, I really hope that there's a game that you'll love making too. Thank you.